The mountain man named Jacob Thornton had survived 2 brutal winters in the Colorado Rockies alone, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of the woman collapsed in the mud outside his cabin on that rain-soaked evening in September of 1876. Her body was curled against the trunk of a gnarled pine tree, soaked through to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her pale face like streaks of ink. At first, Jacob thought she might be dead. He had been checking his trap lines when the storm rolled in from the western peaks, turning the sky the color of old bruises and unleashing a torrent that seemed determined to wash the entire mountainside into the valley below. He had hurried back to his cabin, eager for the warmth of his fire and the shelter of solid walls, when he nearly stumbled over her in the growing darkness. Jacob dropped to one knee beside her, his massive hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. She was breathing, though the movements of her chest were shallow and irregular. Her clothes were little more than rags, a thin cotton dress that might have been blue once but was now the color of creek mud. No coat, no blanket, no supplies of any kind. Just a woman alone in the wilderness, as out of place as a rose growing in a snowdrift. "Miss." His voice was rough from disuse. He spent most of his days talking to nobody but himself and occasionally his mule. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. A soft sound escaped her lips, something between a moan and a sigh. Jacob did not hesitate further. He slid one arm beneath her knees and another behind her back, lifting her as easily as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. She was light, too light, and he could feel every rib through the wet fabric of her dress. How long had she been out here? How long since she had eaten? The rain hammered against his broad shoulders as he carried her the remaining distance to his cabin. His long dark hair, tied back with a strip of leather, hung heavy with water down his back. His buckskin shirt clung to the thick muscles of his chest and arms, muscles earned through years of chopping wood, hauling water, and wrestling with the harsh realities of mountain life. He kicked open the cabin door and ducked inside, grateful for the warm glow of the fire he had banked that morning before heading out. The cabin was small but well built, with thick log walls that kept out the worst of the weather and a stone fireplace that Jacob had constructed himself his first winter up here. He had come to these mountains to escape civilization, to leave behind the memories of the war and the disappointments that followed. The solitude suited him, or at least it had until this moment. Jacob laid the woman down on his bed, the only bed in the single-room cabin, and immediately set about building up the fire. The flames crackled and hissed as he added more wood, filling the space with dancing orange light. Once he was satisfied that the fire would hold, he turned his attention back to his unexpected guest. She was shivering now, her whole body trembling with cold. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint that Jacob recognized as dangerous. He had seen men die from exposure during the war, had watched hypothermia claim soldiers who had seemed fine one moment and were gone the next. He would not let that happen here. Moving with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing size, Jacob began to strip away her wet clothes. He averted his eyes as much as possible, focusing on the practical necessity of the task rather than the intimacy of it. Her dress came off in pieces, the fabric so worn and tattered that it practically disintegrated in his hands. Beneath it she wore a thin chemise, equally soaked, and he removed that as well. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, piling them on until only her face was visible, then positioned her as close to the fire as he dared. For a long while, Jacob simply sat on the floor beside the bed, watching her breathe. The rain continued its assault on the roof, a steady drumming that filled the silence. He should have been thinking about where she came from, about how she ended up half dead outside his cabin, about what he was going to do with her once she woke up. Instead, he found himself studying the delicate curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her lashes against her skin, the way her hair was already beginning to dry into soft waves around her face. She was beautiful. Even bedraggled and unconscious, there was something striking about her. But more than that, there was something fragile and lost that called to some deep protective instinct Jacob had thought long buried. He rose and moved to his small kitchen area, such as it was. A table, a few shelves, some basic supplies. He had beans soaking and some salt pork he could fry up. He set about making a simple broth, something warm and nourishing that would not overwhelm her system when she woke. If she woke. No, he told himself firmly. When she woke, the hours passed slowly. Jacob tended the fire, checked on his patient, and stirred his pot. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Thunder rolled across the peaks like the echo of distant artillery, bringing with it unwelcome memories that Jacob pushed aside. He had come here to forget the war, to forget the things he had done and seen. He would not let those ghosts intrude now. It was well past midnight when she finally stirred. Jacob had dozed off in his chair near the fire, his chin resting on his chest, when a soft sound brought him instantly awake. Years of sleeping light had trained him to respond to the slightest noise. He was on his feet and at her side before his mind had fully cleared. Her eyes were open, wide and dark and filled with confusion. They darted around the cabin, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings before finally settling on Jacob. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, hoarse and weak. "My cabin," Jacob said, trying to make his voice gentle despite its natural roughness. "Up in the Colorado Rockies, about 15 miles from the nearest settlement. I found you outside in the rain. You were in a bad way." She tried to sit up, but the effort cost her. She fell back against the pillow with a gasp, her face pale. "My clothes." "I had to remove them," Jacob said, feeling heat creep up his neck despite the situation. "They were soaked through. You would have died from the cold." "I only did what was necessary to save your life. You are covered, and I have been nothing but respectful." She studied him for a long moment, and Jacob had the uncomfortable feeling of being weighed and measured. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because some of the tension left her body. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I think you probably did save my life." "What is your name?" Jacob asked. "And what were you doing out there alone, Penelope?" she said. "Penelope Sutton, and that is a very long story." "We have time," Jacob said. He gestured to the window, where rain continued to stream down the glass. "Storm does not look like it will be letting up any time soon, and you are not going anywhere until you have recovered your strength." He moved back to the stove and ladled some of the broth into a tin cup. "Can you sit up enough to drink this? You need something warm in you." With Jacob's help, Penelope managed to prop herself up against the wall. She held the cup in both hands, her fingers trembling slightly, and sipped the broth slowly. Jacob watched as color gradually returned to her cheeks, as the terrible bluish tint faded from her lips. Each sip seemed to restore a little more life to her. "I was traveling from Kansas," Penelope said after she had finished half the cup. "My father died 6 months ago. He was all the family I had left. He had a claim on some land here in Colorado, and I thought I might try to make a go of it. I hired a guide in Denver to take me up into the mountains, to show me where the claim was located." Her hands tightened on the cup. "He was not a good man." Jacob felt a cold anger settle in his gut. "What did he do?" "He took my money, what little I had, took my supplies, my horse, left me stranded 3 days ago with nothing." Her voice shook slightly, but she pressed on. "I have been walking ever since, trying to find my way to some kind of civilization. I did not know which direction to go. The mountains all looked the same. And then the storm came, and I just could not walk anymore. I sat down under that tree, and I honestly thought I was going to die there. "You nearly did," Jacob said. He took the empty cup from her and set it aside. "You rest now. We can talk more in the morning. You are safe here, I give you my word on that." Penelope's eyes were already drifting closed. "Thank you, Jacob," she murmured. And then she was asleep again, her breathing deep and even. Jacob returned to his chair, but sleep eluded him now. He kept thinking about what Penelope had told him about the guide who had abandoned her. It was not uncommon, unfortunately. The territories attracted all kinds of men, and not all of them were decent. A lone woman was vulnerable, easy prey for someone without scruples. The fact that Penelope had survived 3 days in the wilderness was remarkable. She was tougher than she looked. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having finally blown itself out during the night. Jacob woke to find Penelope still sleeping, her face peaceful in the early light that filtered through the window. He moved quietly, not wanting to disturb her, and set about his morning routine. He needed to check on his mule, gather more firewood, and see to a dozen other small tasks that made up the daily work of mountain living. When he returned an hour later with an armload of wood, Penelope was awake and sitting up in bed, the blankets wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair had dried into soft waves that fell past her shoulders, and in the daylight he could see that her eyes were a deep brown, almost black in certain lights. "How are you feeling?" Jacob asked, depositing the wood by the fireplace. "Better," Penelope said. "Sore and tired, but better." "I am sorry to impose on you like this. I know I must be quite the inconvenience." "You are no such thing," Jacob said firmly. He moved to the stove and began preparing breakfast, slicing salt pork and setting it to fry. "I have been alone up here for near on 2 years now. The company is actually welcome if you want the truth." 2 years? Penelope's voice was surprised. "You have been up here alone for 2 years?" Jacob shrugged, his broad shoulders moving easily beneath his shirt. "Suits me. I am not much for civilization these days. Too much noise, too many people, too many expectations." He cracked several eggs into the pan, the sizzle and pop filling the cabin with a homey smell. "I have my traps, my garden in the summer, and enough supplies to see me through. It is a simple life, but it is mine." "It sounds lonely," Penelope said quietly. "Sometimes," Jacob admitted. He had never been much for sharing his feelings, but something about this woman invited honesty. "But lonely is better than the alternative, at least for me. I fought in the war, came back to find my family farm sold for taxes, my mother dead. My father remarried and moved east. Everything I thought I was fighting for was just gone. So I came out here where I would not have to look at what I lost every day." Penelope was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice was soft with understanding. "We all carry losses, I suppose. The question is what we do with them." Jacob brought her a plate of food and a fresh cup of coffee, and they ate together in companionable silence. When they finished, Jacob cleared away the dishes and then turned to face her, his expression serious. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said. "You cannot go back out there alone, especially not without supplies or proper clothing. The nearest town is Silverdale, down in the valley. It is a decent enough place, law-abiding for the most part. I can take you there once you have recovered your strength, help you get situated. Maybe find work, save up enough to continue on to your father's claim. Or?" Penelope asked, and Jacob realized she had heard something in his voice he had not entirely intended to reveal. "Or," he said slowly, "you could stay here for a while. I have plenty of space, and the extra pair of hands would not go amiss." Winter is coming and there is a lot of work to be done to prepare. I would not ask anything improper of you," he added quickly. "You would have the bed, I would sleep on the floor, everything respectable and above board." Penelope tilted her head, studying him with those dark eyes. "Why would you offer that? You do not know me. For all you know, I could be a thief or worse." "You could be," Jacob agreed, "but I do not think you are, and I told you I have been alone up here a long time, maybe too long. Having someone to talk to, someone to share meals with, it sounds better than I would have thought possible a week ago." He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly feeling awkward. "But it is your choice. I will take you to Silverdale whenever you want to go. No pressure either way." Penelope was quiet for a long time, her gaze distant as she thought through her options. Finally, she looked back at Jacob and nodded slowly. "I would like to stay, at least for a little while. I have nowhere else to go and you have been nothing but kind to me, but I want to earn my keep. I can cook and clean, tend a garden, mend clothes. I will not be a burden to you." "Fair enough," Jacob said, and he realized he was smiling, something he had not done much of in recent years. "Then we have an arrangement. You rest for another day or two, get your strength back, and then we will see about getting you set up properly." The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Penelope proved to be as good as her word, taking over the cooking and cleaning once she had recovered enough to move around without exhaustion. Jacob had not realized how much he had let his living space deteriorate until he saw it through her eyes. She organized his shelves, washed his clothes and linens, and transformed his rough cabin into something that actually felt like a home. In return, Jacob taught her the skills she would need to survive in the mountains. He showed her how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather in the clouds and wind, how to move quietly through the forest without startling the wildlife. Penelope was a quick study, absorbing information with an intensity that spoke of her determination to never be helpless again. They talked while they worked, sharing stories of their pasts in bits and pieces. Jacob learned that Penelope had grown up in a small Kansas town, that her mother had died when she was 12, that she had spent her teenage years caring for her increasingly frail father while helping him run a small general store. She had never married, never even had a serious suitor, because she had been too busy keeping food on the table and her father comfortable. "He always talked about this land claim in Colorado," Penelope told Jacob one afternoon as they sat on the porch shelling beans. The autumn sun was warm on their faces, and the aspens on the mountainside had turned brilliant gold. "He won it in a card game 20 years ago and always swore he would go out there and build something grand, but he never did. He just talked about it year after year until talking was all he had the strength for. When he died, I thought maybe I could do it for him, make his dream real even if he could not be there to see it." "That is admirable," Jacob said. "A lot of people would have just sold the claim and taken the money." "I thought about it," Penelope admitted, "but I have spent my whole life being practical and careful. I wanted to do something bold for once, something that mattered, even if it was foolish." "It was not foolish," Jacob said firmly. "Hiring that guide was bad luck, but coming out here trying to make a new life that takes courage, more courage than most people have." Penelope glanced at him, and Jacob saw something warm and grateful in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that. Sometimes I wonder if I am just running away, like you did." "Maybe we both are," Jacob said. "But maybe that is all right. Maybe there is nothing wrong with leaving behind things that hurt us and trying to find something better." As the weeks passed and September turned to October, Jacob became increasingly aware that his feelings for Penelope were changing. It was not just that he enjoyed her company, though he did. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she was. It was something deeper, something that had been growing since the moment he first carried her into his cabin. He loved the sound of her voice in the morning, cheerful and bright as she made breakfast. He loved the way she hummed while she worked, tuneless little melodies that filled the cabin with life. He loved her determination, her resilience, the way she faced each new challenge with her chin up and her shoulders back. He loved the way she looked at him sometimes, like he was someone worth knowing, someone worth caring about. But Jacob kept these feelings to himself. Penelope was here because she had nowhere else to go, because he had offered her shelter when she was desperate. The last thing he wanted was to make her feel uncomfortable or obligated. So he maintained a respectful distance, never touching her unnecessarily, always careful to preserve her privacy and dignity. Penelope, for her part, found herself equally conflicted. She had never met a man like Jacob before. He was rough around the edges, certainly, with his long hair and his beard and his simple way of speaking. But beneath that exterior was a man of surprising depth and gentleness. She had seen the way he cared for his animals, patient and kind. She had heard the intelligence in his observations about the world around them. And she had felt the strength in his arms when he helped her over rough terrain, the careful way he made sure she was always safe and comfortable. She caught herself watching him sometimes, admiring the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he chopped wood or hauled water. She found herself wondering what it would be like to be held by those strong arms, to be kissed by that stern mouth. But she told herself these thoughts were foolish. Jacob had given her shelter out of kindness, nothing more. The last thing she should do was mistake his generosity for something deeper. The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that transformed the mountainside into a winter wonderland. Jacob stood on the porch, watching the flakes fall, and felt a knot of worry in his chest. Winter meant being snowed in for weeks at a time. It meant close quarters and long nights with nothing to do but sit by the fire. It meant Penelope would be here in his home through the coldest and most isolated months of the year. "It is beautiful," Penelope said, coming to stand beside him. She had wrapped herself in one of his extra coats, and it hung on her slight frame like a tent. "I have never seen snow on mountains like this before." "It will get deeper," Jacob warned. "A lot deeper. By December, we will be lucky to see the ground again before March. Are you sure you want to stay? I could still take you down to Silverdale before the pass is close. You could find a room there, maybe work in one of the boarding houses or restaurants. You would have more company than just me." Penelope turned to look at him, and Jacob was struck by the intensity in her eyes. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," Jacob said, the word out before he could stop it. "No, I do not want you to leave, but I want you to have a choice. I do not want you to feel trapped here." "I do not feel trapped," Penelope said softly. "I feel safe. That is something I have not felt in a very long time." She hesitated, then added, "Do you mind if I stay, truly?" "I want you to stay," Jacob said, and this time he let himself reach out, let his hand settle on her shoulder. Even through the thick coat, he could feel the warmth of her. "I've gotten used to having you around. The cabin would feel too empty without you now." Something passed between them in that moment, some unspoken understanding that neither was quite ready to put into words. Then Penelope smiled, and the tension broke. "Well then, I suppose we had better make sure we have enough firewood to last until spring." They spent the next few weeks in a flurry of preparation. Jacob cut and split wood until his hands were raw and blistered, stacking cords of it against the side of the cabin. Penelope preserved the last of the garden vegetables, pickling and canning everything she could salvage. They checked and rechecked their supplies, making lists and taking inventory. When the second snow came in early November, heavier than the first, they were as ready as they could be. The cabin was tight and warm, the shelves were full, and the woodpile was stacked high. They settled into the close quarters with surprising ease, finding ways to give each other space even in the small room. Jacob rigged up a blanket partition that he could pull across at night, giving Penelope privacy for sleeping and dressing. He made a comfortable pallet for himself on the floor near the fire and insisted he preferred it to the bed. They established routines, little rhythms that made the days flow smoothly. Mornings were for chores and practical work. Afternoons were for whatever projects caught their interest. Jacob was carving a new set of bowls, while Penelope had taken to mending and remaking her clothes from scraps of fabric Jacob had traded for months ago. Evenings were for sitting by the fire, talking or reading from Jacob's small collection of books. It was during one of these evening conversations in mid-November that Jacob finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. "What about your father's claim? Do you still want to try to find it to build on it?" Penelope set down her sewing and stared into the fire for a long moment. "I do not know," she admitted. "When I left Kansas, it seemed so important, so urgent, like if I did not do this, I would have failed my father somehow. But now I wonder if I was just looking for a purpose, something to fill the emptiness after he died. And I wonder if staying on some isolated piece of land, trying to work it alone, would really honor his memory or just be a slow form of suicide." "You would not have to do it alone," Jacob said carefully. "If you wanted, I could help you. We could look at the claim together, see if it is worth developing, and if it is, we could work it together." Penelope looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why would you do that? You have your life here, your cabin, your traps. Why would you give that up for some stranger's pipe dream?" "You are not a stranger anymore," Jacob said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "Penelope, these past couple of months, having you here, it has changed things for me. I thought I wanted to be alone, thought I needed the isolation to heal from the war and everything that came after. But you have shown me that maybe what I really needed was someone to share the burden with. Someone who understands loss and still finds reasons to smile." Penelope's breath caught. "Jacob, I am not saying this to pressure you," Jacob continued, his rough voice gentle. "I just want you to know that whatever you decide to do, wherever you decide to go, you do not have to do it alone. I will help you if you want my help." The air in the cabin felt charged, electric with possibility. Penelope stood up slowly, setting her sewing aside, and crossed the small space to where Jacob sat. She stopped just in front of him, close enough that he could see the firelight reflected in her eyes. "What if what I want," she said softly, "is to stay here, with you? What if I do not care about the claim anymore, do not care about my father's old dream? What if I just want to build something new, something that is mine, with someone who makes me feel alive for the first time in years?" Jacob rose to his feet, his height and breadth making Penelope have to tilt her head back to look at him. "Then I would say that is what I want too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I would say that you have become the most important thing in my world, and the thought of you leaving makes my chest ache. I would say that I am falling in love with you, Penelope Sutton, and I do not know how to stop it, or even if I want to." Penelope's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Then do not stop," she whispered, "because I am falling in love with you too." Jacob's hands came up to cup her face, his calloused palms gentle against her soft skin. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she did not, when instead she rose up on her toes to meet him, he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss at first, soft and questioning. But then Penelope's arms came around his neck, and Jacob's hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened. All the weeks of restraint, all the careful distance they had maintained, melted away in the heat of that embrace. Jacob had kissed women before, but never like this, never with this sense of rightness of coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against Penelope's. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, ask you to marry me the way a woman deserves to be asked. You carried me in from the rain and saved my life," Penelope said with a soft laugh. "I think we are a bit past traditional courtship, but if you want to ask me something, Jacob Thornton, then ask." Jacob pulled back enough to look into her eyes, his expression serious. "Will you marry me, Penelope? Will you build a life with me, here in these mountains or wherever else you want to be? Will you let me spend every day trying to make you happy and keep you safe?" "Yes," Penelope said, and the word came out fierce and certain. "Yes to all of it. Yes to you." They kissed again, longer this time, until the fire burned low and the cold began to creep into the cabin. Then, reluctantly, they separated. Jacob insisted on maintaining the proprieties, on keeping the blanket partition in place and sleeping on his pallet by the fire. Penelope argued that they were engaged now, that surely they could share the bed, but Jacob was firm. "When we are married," he said, his voice strained with the effort of restraint, "then everything will be different. But until then, I want to treat you with the respect you deserve. You are going to be my wife, Penelope. I will not dishonor you by acting like we are married before we actually are." It was old-fashioned and probably unnecessary given their circumstances, but Penelope found herself loving him even more for it. In a world where men like her guide could betray and abandon a helpless woman, Jacob's integrity shone like a beacon. The next morning they made plans. They would wait until spring, when the snows melted and the passes opened again, and then they would go down to Silverdale. They would find a preacher and make their union official in the eyes of God and the law. In the meantime, they would spend the winter preparing, dreaming, and building the foundation of their future together. The long Colorado winter that Jacob had worried about became something magical. The enforced closeness that might have been stifling instead drew them closer together. They learned each other's habits and quirks, the little details that made them who they were. Jacob discovered that Penelope sang to herself when she thought he could not hear, soft lullabies her mother had taught her as a child. Penelope learned that Jacob had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh until her sides ached. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their hopes and fears with an honesty neither had ever managed with another person. Jacob told her about the war, about the friends he had lost, and the things he had done that still haunted him. Penelope told him about her lonely childhood, about watching her mother die and then spending years watching her father slowly slip away. "I was so tired," she confessed one night as they sat by the fire. "Not just physically, though God knows I was that too, but tired in my soul, you know. Tired of always being the strong one, the responsible one. Tired of having nothing to look forward to but more of the same. When I sat down under that tree in the rain, part of me was relieved. I thought, at least it will be over, at least I can rest." Jacob's arm tightened around her shoulders. She had started sitting next to him on the floor after they got engaged, leaning against his solid warmth while they talked. "And now," he asked quietly. "Now I am not tired anymore," Penelope said. "Now I want to live, really live, not just exist. You gave me that, Jacob. You gave me a reason to get up in the morning, something to hope for." "You gave me the same thing," Jacob said. "I did not realize how much I had given up until you showed me it was possible to try again." December brought heavy snows that buried the cabin to the eaves. They dug tunnels to reach the woodpile and the small shed where Jacob kept his mule. The world beyond their little clearing became impassable, a white wilderness that stretched to the horizons. But inside the cabin, life was warm and full of quiet joy. Christmas came, and though they had few resources for gifts, they found ways to celebrate. Jacob carved Penelope a delicate wooden comb, spending hours working the wood until it was smooth and polished. Penelope used some of her precious thread to embroider a handkerchief for Jacob, stitching his initials in the corner with tiny, perfect letters. They exchanged their gifts on Christmas morning, and both pretended not to see the tears in the other's eyes. "Next year," Jacob said, "we will do better. We will have a proper Christmas with a tree and presents and maybe even some peppermint candy from the general store." "Next year," Penelope agreed, "we will be married. That is the only present I need." January and February passed in a blur of snow and cold. They had plenty of supplies, and Jacob's careful planning meant they never wanted for anything essential. But more than that, they had each other. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled around the cabin and the temperature dropped to dangerous lows, they pushed the beds together and slept back to back, sharing warmth while still maintaining the boundaries Jacob had set. It was both torture and bliss, feeling her so close and yet not allowing himself to act on the desire that burned steadily hotter with each passing day. March arrived, and with it, the first signs of spring. The snows began to melt, creating rushing streams that cascaded down the mountainside. The aspens budded with new green leaves. Animals emerged from hibernation, and the forest came alive with sound and movement again. Jacob ventured out to check his trap lines, which he had largely neglected over the winter. He had enough furs stored from previous seasons to trade, and trapping seemed less important now that he had Penelope to think about. He would need to find new ways to make money, ways that would not keep him away from home for days at a time. When he returned from one such excursion in early April, he found Penelope standing on the porch, her face turned toward the sun. She looked different somehow, more vibrant and alive than she had even at the height of winter. When she saw him, her face broke into a brilliant smile that made his heart stutter in his chest. "The pass is open," she called out as he approached. "Old Tom came by while you were gone. He said the road to Silverdale is passable now, muddy but passable." Old Tom was a prospector who lived further up the mountain, a grizzled hermit who occasionally stopped by to trade news and supplies. Jacob nodded slowly. "Then I suppose it is time." "Time to get married," Penelope said, and the joy in her voice was unmistakable. They spent the next week preparing for the journey. Jacob loaded his pack mule with furs to trade, and Penelope packed a small bag with her few possessions. The night before they were set to leave, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of pink and gold. "Are you nervous?" Jacob asked, taking her hand in his. "No," Penelope said truthfully. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are my home, Jacob, not this cabin, not these mountains. You. Wherever you are, that is where I want to be." "I feel the same way," Jacob said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "These months with you have been the happiest of my life. I cannot wait to make you my wife." The journey down to Silverdale took 2 days. The trails were muddy and treacherous with snowmelt, but Jacob navigated them with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately. Penelope rode the mule while Jacob walked alongside, one hand always ready to steady her if needed. Silverdale was exactly as Jacob had described it, a rough but respectable mining town, nestled in a valley surrounded by steep peaks. It had a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a few saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, and most importantly, a small church with a resident minister. They went to the church first, even before finding a place to stay. The minister, a kind-faced man named Reverend Hayes, listened to their story and agreed to perform the ceremony the following day. "Give you time to get cleaned up and rested," he said with a gentle smile. A wedding should be a joyous occasion, not something rushed through when you are half dead from travel. Jacob traded his furs at the general store and used the money to rent them 2 rooms at the boarding house, separate rooms, because even now, so close to the wedding, he insisted on propriety. With the remaining money, he bought Penelope a simple dress, nothing fancy but clean and new and a world better than the remade rags she had been wearing. He bought himself a new shirt as well, and paid the barber to trim his hair and beard. When Penelope saw him that evening, cleaned up and dressed in his new clothes, she actually gasped. He had always been handsome in a rough, untamed way, but now he looked almost civilized, his strong features softened by the careful grooming. "Jacob Thornton," she said, her voice full of admiration, "you are going to make a very fine-looking husband." Jacob felt heat creep up his neck. "You have not seen yourself yet," he said. "That dress suits you. You look beautiful." They ate dinner together in the boarding house dining room, making quiet conversation while around them, miners and prospectors laughed and argued and told tall tales. It felt strange to be around so many people after months of isolation. More than once, Jacob saw Penelope flinch at a sudden loud noise or shrink back when someone got too close. He made sure to keep himself between her and the rest of the room, a solid protective presence. That night, lying in her narrow bed in her rented room, Penelope could not sleep. Tomorrow she would marry Jacob Thornton. Tomorrow her life would truly begin. She thought about the woman she had been when she left Kansas, desperate and grieving and lost. She thought about that terrible moment sitting under the tree in the rain, too exhausted to go on. If someone had told her then that she would find love in the mountains, that she would marry a man who made her feel safe and cherished and desired, she would have thought them mad. But here she was, on the verge of happiness she had never dared to dream of. Life, she reflected, had a strange way of working out. The wedding took place at noon the next day in the small church. There were no guests besides Reverend Hayes and his wife, who served as witnesses. Penelope wore her new dress and a crown of wildflowers that Mrs. Hayes had helped her weave that morning. Jacob wore his new shirt and had polished his boots until they shone. They stood before the altar, hands clasped, and repeated the vows that would bind them together for life. When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife and gave Jacob permission to kiss his bride, Jacob cupped Penelope's face in his big hands and kissed her with all the love and longing that had built up over the long winter months. It was a kiss that promised everything: passion and protection, partnership and devotion. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and flushed. They signed the marriage certificate, making everything legal and official, and then walked out of the church into the bright spring sunshine as man and wife. Jacob had arranged for them to stay another night in Silverdale, but this time he had only rented 1 room. The boarding house room was small and simple, but to Penelope it might as well have been a palace. Jacob carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the absurdity and rightness of the tradition. He set her down gently, and then for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other. "I have been dreaming about this moment since the day I asked you to marry me," Jacob said softly. His hand settled on her waist, warm and possessive. "Longer than that, if I am honest. There were nights this winter when I thought I would lose my mind, lying just a few feet away from you and not being able to hold you the way I wanted to." "You do not have to hold back anymore," Penelope said. She reached up to thread her fingers through his hair, pulling him down until their lips were almost touching. "I am your wife now, Jacob. I am yours in every way." What followed was tender and passionate and utterly right. Jacob was gentle with her, patient despite his own obvious desire, making sure her first time was as pleasurable as he could manage. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, skin against skin, and Penelope thought she had never felt so complete. This was what she had been missing all those years in Kansas, she realized. Not just physical intimacy, though that was wonderful, but this deep connection, this sense of belonging to someone who belonged to her in return. They stayed in Silverdale for 3 more days, partly because they needed to purchase supplies for the return journey and partly because neither was in any hurry to leave the privacy of their room. But eventually practicality won out, and they packed up and headed back into the mountains. The cabin felt different when they returned to it. It was not just Jacob's place anymore, or even the place where Penelope had been staying. It was their home, the first home that either of them had chosen freely. They settled back into their routines, but everything was richer now, deeper. The casual touches they had carefully avoided before now came freely. A hand on the small of her back as Jacob passed behind her. A kiss pressed to his shoulder as Penelope moved around the cabin. The easy intimacy of two people who belonged to each other. Spring turned to summer, and they worked together to expand the garden and make improvements to the cabin. Jacob built an addition, creating a separate bedroom so they would have more space. Penelope learned to fish in the nearby stream and proved to have a natural talent for it. They talked about the future, making plans. "We could stay here," Jacob said one evening as they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. "I have enough saved up that we could buy the land from the government, make it officially ours. Or we could go look at your father's claim, see if we want to try to develop it. Or we could go somewhere else entirely, start completely fresh." "What do you want?" Penelope asked. She was curled against his side, her head on his shoulder. "I want you to be happy," Jacob said simply. "That is all I have ever wanted since the day I carried you in from the rain. Everything else is just details." Penelope was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "I think I want to stay here. This place, these mountains, this cabin, they gave me my life back. They gave me you. I do not need my father's claim or some grand adventure. I just need this, what we have right here." "Then that is what we will do," Jacob said. He kissed the top of her head. "We will make this cabin into a real home, build a life here together. Maybe raise some children if we are blessed that way." "I would like that," Penelope said softly. "Children, a family, something neither of us had before." As summer progressed into fall, they continued to build their life together. Jacob made a trip down to Silverdale to officially file on the land, securing their homestead. While he was gone for those 3 days, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She waited anxiously for his return, bursting with the news but wanting to tell him in person. When Jacob finally rode up to the cabin, tired and dusty from the journey, Penelope ran out to meet him. "I have something to tell you," she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. Jacob dismounted and caught her up in his arms, lifting her clear off the ground in a bear hug. "What is it?" "You look like you are about to burst." "We are going to have a baby," Penelope said, and then laughed at the expression of pure shock on Jacob's face. For a moment he just stared at her. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, the biggest smile she had ever seen from him. "A baby," he repeated, and his voice was full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." He set her down carefully as if she were suddenly made of glass. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you even be out here? It is cold, you should be inside by the fire." Penelope laughed at his sudden overprotectiveness. "I am fine, Jacob. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am not going to break." But Jacob was not to be deterred. For the rest of her pregnancy, he treated her like she was made of spun sugar, insisting she rest and let him handle all the heavy work. Penelope found it both frustrating and endearing. She had not been coddled like this since her mother died, and while part of her chafed at the restrictions, another part of her loved that Jacob cared so much. The winter was harder with Penelope pregnant, but they managed. Jacob made sure they were even better stocked than before, and he rarely left the cabin for more than a few hours at a time. As Penelope's belly grew, he would sit with her in the evenings and talk to the baby, telling stories about the mountains and the animals and the life they would share. "I hope the baby has your eyes," Penelope said one night, running her hand over the swell of her stomach. "Dark and serious and full of depth." "I hope the baby has your smile," Jacob countered, "the one that lights up the whole room and makes everything seem possible." Their son was born on a cold March morning in 1878, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Jacob had ridden down to fetch the midwife from Silverdale weeks earlier, paying her to stay at the cabin as Penelope's time drew near. He held Penelope's hand through the whole ordeal, his face pale but determined to be there for her. When the midwife finally placed the squirming, red-faced baby in Penelope's arms, Jacob felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. This tiny person was his son, his and Penelope's, a perfect blend of them both. The baby had Penelope's dark hair and Jacob's strong features, and when he opened his eyes, they were a deep blue that might darken to brown or stay blue as he grew. "What should we name him?" Penelope asked, exhausted but glowing with happiness. Jacob thought for a moment, then said, "Thomas, after your father. He may not have made it out here to claim his land, but in a way his dream brought you to me. I think he deserves to be remembered." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Jacob Thornton," she said, testing out the name. "It is perfect." The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy little boy with his mother's curiosity and his father's love of the outdoors. When he was 3, Penelope had another baby, a girl they named Mary after Jacob's mother. Then 2 years after that came another boy, Samuel, who inherited Penelope's dark eyes and sweet temperament. The cabin expanded with the family, Jacob adding rooms and improvements as they needed them. He continued to hunt and trap, but less frequently now. Penelope started a small business selling her preserves and needlework to the general store in Silverdale, bringing in extra income while still being able to stay home with the children. They were not rich by any means, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, happy. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, Jacob and Penelope would sit together on the porch like they used to in those early days. Sometimes they talked, catching up on the events of the day or making plans for the future. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and listening to the sounds of the forest. "You remember the night I found you?" Jacob asked one such evening. The children were 10 years older now, Mary and Samuel grown into young people who helped with the work around the homestead while Thomas, the eldest, was learning to hunt and trap with his father. "How could I forget?" Penelope said with a soft laugh. "I was sitting under that tree, convinced I was going to die, and then you appeared like some kind of miracle, all muscle and determination, and carried me to safety." "I almost did not see you," Jacob admitted. "It was getting dark and the rain was coming down so hard. If I had been looking the other way, if I had been just a few minutes faster or slower, I would have missed you completely." Penelope squeezed his hand. "But you did not miss me. You found me, and you saved me, and you gave me a life I never could have imagined. 3 beautiful children, a home I love, and you, always you." "I saved you," Jacob said, "but you saved me right back. I was so lost before you came along, Penelope. I thought I wanted to be alone, but I was really just hiding from life. You made me brave enough to try again, to open my heart to the possibility of happiness." They sat in silence for a moment, both reflecting on the strange and wonderful path that had brought them together. Then Penelope leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they watched the sun set over the mountains they called home. The years continued to roll by, marked by small joys and inevitable sorrows. They lost Samuel to a fever when he was just 12, a grief that nearly broke them both. But they held on to each other and to their remaining children, and slowly the raw pain faded to a bearable ache. Thomas grew up and married a girl from Silverdale, bringing her back to build a cabin on the far end of their land. Mary stayed close to home, helping her mother and showing no particular interest in the young men who occasionally came calling. Jacob's hair turned silver, and his body, though still strong, moved a bit slower than it once had. Penelope's face acquired the soft lines of a life well lived, laugh lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of years of smiles. They grew old together, exactly as they had promised on that spring day when they married in the little church in Silverdale. On their 30th anniversary, Jacob took Penelope back to the spot where he had found her all those years ago. The tree was still there, though larger now, and the ground around it was carpeted with wildflowers. They stood together in the warm summer sunshine, so different from that rain-soaked night, and Jacob pulled Penelope into his arms. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up that night. For fighting to survive, even when you thought you could not. Because if you had given up, I never would have found you, and my life would have been so much emptier." "Thank you for seeing me," Penelope replied, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "For caring enough to stop to help a stranger who had nothing to offer you. You gave me everything, Jacob Thornton. A home, a family, a love that has sustained me through every joy and every sorrow. I would not trade a single moment of our life together." They kissed then, a sweet kiss full of 30 years of devotion and commitment, and then walked hand in hand back to their cabin, their home, their refuge, the place where two lost souls had found each other and built something beautiful. Thomas's children, their grandchildren, were playing in the yard when they arrived, their laughter ringing out across the clearing. Mary was hanging laundry, singing softly to herself, and from inside the cabin came the smell of bread baking and stew simmering. It was a scene of perfect domestic contentment, so far removed from the lonely, isolated existence Jacob had been living when Penelope stumbled into his life. As they stood on the porch and surveyed their domain, Jacob felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. He had fought in a war, lost everything he thought mattered, and run away to the mountains to nurse his wounds. He had been prepared to live out his days alone, convinced that solitude was all he deserved or needed. But then Penelope had come, bedraggled and half dead, and with her arrival everything had changed. She had brought light into his darkness, hope into his despair, and love into a heart he thought had forgotten how to feel. Together they had built a life, raised a family, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, and created a legacy that would outlast them both. "You have any regrets?" Penelope asked quietly as they watched their grandchildren play. Jacob considered the question seriously. There were things he wished had been different, certainly. He wished they had not lost Samuel. He wished the war had never happened, that he had not seen and done the things that still occasionally haunted his dreams. He wished he could have spared Penelope the hardship of that guide abandoning her, could have found her before she reached such a desperate state, but regrets about their life together, about the choices they had made, the path they had walked. "No," he said finally, "no regrets. Every moment, good and bad, led us here, and here is exactly where I want to be." Penelope nodded, satisfied. "Then we have done well, you and I. We have loved each other and our children. We have built something that will last beyond our time. That is all anyone can ask for." They lived for many more years in their mountain home, watching their grandchildren grow and eventually welcoming great-grandchildren. Jacob's body finally gave out when he was 78, his heart simply deciding it had beaten enough times. He died peacefully in the bed he had given up to Penelope on that first night, with her hand in his and their family gathered around. Penelope followed him 2 years later, quietly slipping away in her sleep on a spring morning very much like the one when their son Thomas had been born. She was buried next to Jacob on a hill overlooking the cabin, under the shade of an aspen grove that blazed gold every autumn. The cabin stayed in the family for generations, each one adding their own touches while carefully preserving the original structure that Jacob had built. The story of how Jacob had found Penelope sitting in the rain, too tired to move, and carried her inside to warmth and rest, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story about love and second chances, about the courage to keep fighting even when all seemed lost, and about the unexpected ways life can surprise us if we remain open to possibility. And in that way, their love lived on, not just in the children and grandchildren who carried their blood, but in the story itself, a testament to the fact that even in our darkest moments, salvation might be just around the corner, carried in the strong arms of someone who will see us, truly see us, and choose to care. The mountain remained as it always had, solid and unchanging, a silent witness to all the small human dramas played out in its shadow. But for Jacob and Penelope Thornton, it had been more than just a mountain. It had been the foundation of their love, the setting for their story, and the home where they had built a life that mattered. And in the end, what more could anyone ask for than that?